She looked me straight in the eyes and whispered, "If you tell anyone about tonight, we're done." In that moment, I knew nothing between us would ever be the same. The night had that kind of stillness that comes after a long evening, when the laughter from the gathering has faded, and the world feels quieter than usual. I was standing outside, hands in my pockets, not really expecting anything more than a silent walk home. But then she appeared beside me, 43 years old, confident in the way she carried herself, but with something softer in her eyes when she looked at me. She tilted her head slightly, keys dangling in her hand, and asked, "Do you need a ride?" Her voice wasn't casual. It carried this quiet weight, like she'd already thought about asking and wasn't sure if she should. I was 24, and in her presence, I always felt caught between awe and ease. She had this graceful composure about her, the kind that made you straighten up without realizing. I nodded, and she unlocked the car. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed the warmth of her perfume, something subtle, amber with a hint of vanilla. It wasn't overpowering, but it lingered just enough to make the small space feel different, more intimate. The engine hummed softly as she started driving. Streetlights cut across her face in passing stripes of gold and shadow, revealing details I'd never let myself linger on before. The fine lines near her eyes, the way her mouth pressed into thought when she concentrated, the steady curve of her shoulders. We didn't speak much at first. The silence wasn't awkward though, it was thick, almost deliberate. I found myself watching the way her hands moved on the steering wheel. Strong, graceful, but every so often, she'd drum her fingers lightly, as if she needed something to do with the energy between us. At one point, when she shifted gears, her hand brushed against mine resting on the console. It was the lightest touch, barely anything at all, but it sent a quick, sharp pulse through me. She didn't acknowledge it, her gaze stayed fixed on the road, but I felt my chest tighten, like my body had caught a signal my mind wasn't ready to name. The rain had left the streets slick, and the headlights reflected on the pavement like molten silver. Inside that car, it felt like the rest of the world had pulled back, leaving only the sound of the tires on wet asphalt and the quiet rhythm of our breathing. I should have been thinking about home, about the ordinary ending of an ordinary night. But something in her presence shifted the air. Every glance, every silence carried a question neither of us dared to ask. It was just a ride in the dark, nothing more. And yet, sitting there beside her, wrapped in the faint warmth of her perfume and the calm steadiness of her driving, I already knew this night would not end the way I expected. The drive was supposed to be short. Just a straight line to my apartment, a polite thank you, and then we'd go our separate ways. That's what I kept telling myself as I watched the city slide past the windows, quiet neighborhoods, glowing street lamps, the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. But she didn't turn down my street. Instead, as we came close, her hands tightened slightly on the wheel, and she slowed. For a second, I thought she'd missed the turn. But she didn't. She just kept driving, her eyes fixed forward, her lips pressed into something that looked a lot like hesitation. Finally, she glanced at me, just briefly, before looking back to the road. "Do you want to stop by for a bit?" Her voice was calm, but it carried something else beneath it. Not casual. Not careless. It was an invitation weighed down with meaning, the kind that hangs in the air long after the words are spoken. I hesitated, maybe for only half a heartbeat, but I think she saw it. She always seemed to notice the smallest shifts in me. Before I could talk myself out of it, I nodded. "Sure." Her building wasn't far, a quiet place, tucked on a tree-lined street. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the soft hum of the engine seemed louder than it should have as she shut it off. We sat there for a moment, either of us moving, the silence charged in a way that made my pulse quicken. Then she gave a small, decisive nod, almost to herself, and stepped out. Inside, her apartment was warm, softly lit. The air smelled faintly of lavender, calming, but beneath it was something uniquely her, like the echo of her perfume still clinging to the air. I slipped off my shoes, trying not to look like I was staring as I took in the details. Shelves lined with neatly arranged books, framed photographs of people I didn't know, a small vase of fresh flowers on the table. Everything about the space felt intentional, but lived in, like her. "Tea?" she asked, her voice carrying that same steadiness, though I could see the slight curve of uncertainty at the corner of her mouth. I nodded again, my throat dry. I sat on the edge of the sofa while she moved around the kitchen. I could hear the clink of cups, the rush of hot water, the soft shuffle of her steps. And then she was back, holding 2 mugs, steam curling upward. When she handed one to me, our fingers brushed. Just the faintest touch. But it was enough. A spark, sharp and warm, passed through me before I could stop it. I caught her eyes in that moment. She didn't pull away quickly, but she didn't acknowledge it either. She just let the silence stretch, then sat beside me. The tea sat untouched between us, the steam fading into the air. The real heat was somewhere else, rising quietly, steadily, in the space neither of us dared name. The tea sat between us, growing colder by the minute, untouched. Neither of us seemed interested in drinking it. Instead, we sat in the quiet hum of her living room, the soft glow of a lamp spilling warm light over the shelves and the edges of the sofa. I don't know who spoke first. Maybe it was her, maybe it was me, but the conversation drifted somewhere deeper almost immediately. Not the surface-level chatter people use to fill silence, but the kind of words that rise when 2 people stop pretending they don't need to be heard. She leaned back against the cushions, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug as if it gave her something to hold on to. "People think I'm always put together," she said, her eyes fixed somewhere in the distance. "They look at me and assume I have everything handled. But the truth is, most of the time I feel invisible." Her voice didn't break, but there was a small tremor in it, like the words had been waiting too long inside her. I turned to look at her, really look at her. She wasn't invisible, not to me. Every movement, every glance, every pause she gave had been pulling me closer without either of us naming it. I set my mug down and shifted, angling toward her. "I don't see you that way," I said quietly. "I don't see someone who's invisible. I see someone who fills a room without even trying." She gave a soft laugh, but it wasn't amusement, it was disbelief mixed with something like relief. Her fingers tightened around the mug, knuckles pale. And before I could think twice, I reached out, gently covering her hands with mine. Her skin was warm, her grip firm but trembling slightly beneath it. She froze at first, eyes flicking down to where my hand rested over hers. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a slow, shaky breath, her chest rising and falling as though she'd been holding it in for too long. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, glistening in the lamplight. There was strength there, but also something raw, fragile, something she didn't let many people see. "You're easy to talk to," she whispered, her lips parting just enough for the words to slip out. "Too easy." The way she said it wasn't a compliment, it was a confession. A warning to herself as much as to me. The space between us felt suddenly smaller, though either of us moved. I could feel the heat of her hands beneath mine, the faint tremor in her fingers, the quickened rhythm of her breathing. My chest ached with the weight of what wasn't being said. In that moment, the tea might as well not have existed. The only thing that mattered was the fragile thread pulling us closer, the quiet truth she'd finally let slip, and the unspoken question hanging heavy in the room: what happens if we stop resisting this? The silence after her confession wasn't empty, it was dense, charged, pressing down on both of us. My hand was still resting over hers, and though she hadn't moved away, I could feel her wrestling with something unspoken. Then, suddenly, she set her mug aside and stood, leaving my hand empty. She moved to the window, her back turned, her arms crossing over her chest like she needed a shield. The soft glow of the city filtered in, reflecting against the glass and outlining her silhouette. She looked untouchable in that moment, like a figure caught between strength and fragility. For a long time, she didn't say anything. Just stood there, staring at the lights outside as though the answers were hidden in them. I stayed where I was on the couch, giving her space, though every part of me wanted to follow. Finally, she spoke. "This, whatever this is." Her voice was steady at first, but I could hear the break underneath it, subtle but real. She shook her head. It's dangerous. The word hung there, sharp and heavy. I swallowed hard. Dangerous how? She turned then, her eyes locking onto mine, fierce but clouded with fear. Because people talk. Because I'm 43 and you're 24. Because I've spent too many years building a life where people believe I have everything under control. And if they saw me here, with you, all of that would unravel. Her arms tightened around herself as though she was trying to hold the pieces together. She took a step closer, and her voice dropped, low and deliberate. If you tell anyone about tonight. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if daring me to challenge her. We're done. The words landed like a stone in my chest. Not shouted, not even sharp, but absolute. It wasn't anger I heard in her voice. It was fear disguised as control. I stood slowly, closing a bit of the distance between us, careful not to move too fast. I wouldn't tell anyone. I said, the truth plain in my voice. Not because you asked me not to. Because this, what's happening right now, it's not something I'd ever risk cheapening with gossip. Her eyes softened for just a second, almost enough to break her composure, but then she straightened, pulling herself back into that familiar armor. She turned her face slightly, as though looking at me too directly would undo her. I could see the battle inside her. She wanted to push me away, to keep the lines clear, but the way her hands trembled, the way her breathing quickened when I stepped closer, told me that part of her wanted to stay in this moment just as much as I did. Still, the warning was clear. Tonight was fragile. Tonight had rules. And if I broke them, it would all vanish before it had the chance to become anything more. Her words still echoed in the room. If you tell anyone about tonight, we're done. They pressed against my chest like a weight, heavy and final. But beneath that sharp edge, there was something else in her eyes, something that betrayed the firmness of her warning. Fear, yes, but also longing. She stood by the window, arms folded across herself, the city lights behind her casting her in a soft glow. She looked untouchable, as if distance was the only thing keeping her steady. But I couldn't stay seated anymore. I rose slowly, careful with every step, like approaching something fragile that might vanish if I moved too quickly. I stopped just a breath away from her. I could feel the warmth radiating off her body, even though we weren't touching. She didn't step back. She didn't move at all, except for the way her shoulders rose and fell with a slow, uneven breath. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, charged and unbroken. My hand lifted almost on its own, hesitant but certain, and I reached toward her. A single strand of her hair had slipped loose, brushing against her cheek. With the lightest touch, I tucked it gently behind her ear. Her breath caught. I felt it more than I heard it, the subtle intake of air as my fingers grazed her skin. Soft, warm, more real than anything I'd touched in a long time. For a second, I thought she would turn away. But instead, her eyes closed, just briefly, like she was allowing herself to feel it. When she opened them again, there was no armor left in her gaze. Just raw vulnerability. My hand drifted downward, not forced, not rushed, just enough to find hers where it rested against her folded arms. Our fingers touched, brushed, then lingered. She hesitated, the faintest tremor running through her hand, and then, finally, she let it rest in mine. It wasn't a grip, not even a full hold. It was permission. The kind that says more than words ever could. I closed my hand gently, feeling the warmth of her skin, the delicate strength of her fingers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her thumb trace the side of my hand, the smallest movement, but one that made my chest tighten. The room was silent except for the steady rhythm of our breathing. I could feel every detail, the faint press of her palm, the tension in her body, the way she leaned ever so slightly closer, though she kept herself from closing the gap completely. We didn't kiss. We didn't cross the line her warning had drawn. But in that quiet moment, with her hand in mine and the city lights flickering across her face, it felt like we already had. It wasn't the kind of closeness that shouts. It was the kind that whispers, the kind that says, we're already too far gone to go back. Time seemed to lose its shape after that. The world outside faded into the background, as if the rain tapping softly against the window had swallowed every sound except the quiet rhythm of our breaths. We sat back down on the sofa, still holding hands, though either of us acknowledged it out loud. At first, our words came cautiously, like stones skipping across a lake, gentle, measured, testing the waters. She asked about my family, and I told her stories I hadn't shared with anyone in years. I asked about her work, and she spoke about the exhaustion that comes with always having to be the strong one, the reliable one. Her voice carried weariness, but also a strength I admired even more in that moment. The longer we talked, the deeper we drifted. We spoke of regrets, of things left unsaid, of choices made too early or too late. She confessed she sometimes felt she had missed her chance at real love, that people only ever saw the surface of her life, never the truth beneath it. Her honesty wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady, like she was peeling back a layer she rarely let anyone touch. I listened, not just with my ears, but with every part of me. There was a pull in her words, in the way her voice softened when she admitted something vulnerable. And when she grew too quiet, I found myself filling the silence with my own truths. I told her about feeling lost, about not knowing where I was supposed to belong, about the weight of expectations I hadn't asked for. At some point, she shifted closer, her body brushing lightly against mine. She didn't ask permission, she just let her head rest against my shoulder, the crown of her hair soft against my cheek. My arm, almost instinctively, slipped around her. Not tightly, not to claim her, but to steady her, to let her know she was safe in that moment. I could feel her breathing, slow, measured, a little uneven, as if she was allowing herself to relax for the first time all night. Her heartbeat was steady, faint but present, pressing through the delicate space where her shoulder leaned into me. The rain grew heavier, pattering against the glass in a rhythm that seemed to wrap the room in its own cocoon. The outside world no longer existed. No judgment, no whispers, no eyes, just us, suspended in this fragile slice of time. We talked until the words ran out, and then we just sat there, the silence no longer heavy but warm, like a blanket we'd both agreed to share. My cheek brushed lightly against her hair, and though it was the smallest touch, it felt monumental. Neither of us called it love. Neither of us dared to name it. But sitting there, her trust leaning into me, the night folding us in its quiet embrace, I knew something had shifted. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight belonged only to us. At some point, the night began to thin. The steady rhythm of rain softened, and faint traces of pale light crept along the edges of the curtains. I hadn't even noticed how late it had grown, how many hours had slipped away while we sat together, cocooned in something neither of us had dared to name. She stirred against me, her head lifting slowly from my shoulder. There was a heaviness in her movement, the reluctance of someone who didn't want to wake from a dream. Her eyes lingered on mine for a moment too long, soft, unreadable, carrying both closeness and distance all at once. "We should," she started, her voice quiet, unfinished. She didn't need to finish. I knew what she meant. I nodded, even though every part of me wanted to resist, to freeze time exactly where it was. But the day was waiting, and the world outside her door wouldn't be as forgiving as the night had been. She walked me to the door. The hallway beyond was dim, colored by the first hesitant brushstrokes of dawn. My shoes sat neatly where I'd left them, and slipping them back on felt strangely final, like closing a book you weren't ready to finish. When I turned back to her, she was standing close, closer than she had to. Her arms weren't folded this time, she wasn't hiding. Instead, she lifted one hand and placed it gently against my chest. The warmth of her palm rested over my heartbeat, steady and unguarded. For a moment, neither of us moved, and the silence between us filled with everything we hadn't said. Her eyes searched mine, fierce and vulnerable all at once. Then, in a voice softer than a whisper but sharp enough to cut straight through me, she said, "Don't make me regret tonight." The words weren't a threat. They were a plea. A fragile promise wrapped in fear, asking me to protect something we both knew was too delicate for the world outside. I swallowed hard, nodding. "I won't." My voice came out low, steady, carrying more conviction than I'd expected. She studied me for another heartbeat, as if testing the truth of my answer, and then her expression softened. A trembling smile broke across her lips, hesitant but real. She leaned in, slowly, deliberately, and pressed her lips against my cheek. It wasn't a long kiss, not dramatic or desperate. Just the lightest brush, warm, fleeting, but it left a mark that sank deeper than I could ever explain. When she pulled back, I could still feel the ghost of it lingering on my skin, an imprint I knew I'd carry long after I walked away. The door opened with a quiet click, letting in the cool breath of morning air. I stepped into it reluctantly, glancing back one last time. She stood framed in the doorway, strong and graceful, yet with a trace of vulnerability she hadn't hidden from me tonight. And as I walked away, the weight of her hand still pressed over my heartbeat. I knew this wasn't an ending. It was the fragile, uncertain beginning of something that might never be spoken aloud, something only the two of us would ever understand.